Hi, welcome to Chapter 4. This chapter we're going to talk all about ethics and sort of how we use ethics in research and how these guide certain actions and behaviors and how we kind of go about the process of research. We'll talk about some history of ethics and research as well. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into Chapter 4, Ethical Guidelines for Psychological Research. So a few things we're going to talk about here is we're going to first talk about some historical examples of some less than ethical research that's been done in the past and what has prompted some more ethical treatment of current research. We're going to talk about some ethical principles and practices just in general. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some animal research and how that has evolved and taught us how to kind of treat and work in research with animals going forward. And then finally, kind of some just ethical decision making and how we go about this in our own research. All right, so first we're going to talk about two historical examples of some less than ethical research that was done in the past. So the first of these examples is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And the next study we're going to look at is the Milgram obedience study, which again has sort of a different ethical outcome, but one that is a little bit more psychological in nature rather than physical, like the Tuskegee studies, but both of which sort of drove important updates and important ways that we now conduct research with these ethical principles in mind. All right, so let's first talk about the Tuskegee syphilis studies. And these were a set of research studies or a general research study that was done back in the 1930s and showed some really unethical research practices. And so generally what this study looked at was this idea that they wanted to observe syphilis and see how untreated syphilis progressed and developed over time. And they recruited a lot of Black Americans and used these men as participants and told them that they were being treated for one thing when they really, weren't being treated in this case. And so while they were separated into different groups like placebo and control and treatment groups, even those that were in the groups that had syphilis but were in the control or treatment groups were not actually receiving treatment. And where this gets really bad is after the treatment was discovered years later and was identified as the best way to actually treat syphilis, participants still didn't receive that treatment. But what's even worse is that many of them were still under the impression that they were being treated for it, thinking that they were in a certain group in the experiment. And so this really kind of, had some long-lasting factors and some long-lasting consequences to these participants, and I think just to research in general. And so it wasn't until the 1970s when this was actually, really kind of brought to light and, tried to sort of produce some maybe beneficial learning from this process. And we're going to see both with this and the next study we talk about that they led to sort of this agreement or this report that started to incorporate these ideas and how we should move forward and conduct research in a much more ethical way and to treat people in a more beneficial way. And so this was a really early study that, again, not done well and that we are trying to learn from. The second study here is the Milgram obedience study, and this one is an interesting study as well. Less physical repercussions to participants, but more psychological repercussions for them. These participants were sort of under the impression that they were doing what an authority figure told them to do, but in that process were administering electric shocks to another participant. Now, they weren't actually doing this. They were just under the impression that they were, and they were told by this authority figure to continue increasing the strength of the electric shock every time this other participant got the answer wrong. And what was really kind of interesting to see was how participants did listen to authority figures and administered these higher and higher degrees of electric shocks. Now, again, they weren't actually administering them, but they thought that they were. And so even though they thought that this was bad and they didn't want to do it, they were still willing to listen to the authority figure and, go through with the process. Even afterwards, when they were told, that they didn't actually administer these electric shocks, there was still a lot of psychological harm that was done to these participants simply due to the fact that they had this realization that they were willing to do it in the first place. And they maybe thought that they would never do something like that, even if someone told them to do it. But they realized after the fact that maybe they were. And so this was a pivotal psychological study as well that we talk about and we look at in this sort of context of learning what not to do today. And so even just using debriefing and explaining at the end of a study doesn't always eliminate all of the harm or the risks that happened during the study. And so from these and a few other cases as well, they created what's called the Belmont Report. And this has really three core principles of ethical standards in research today. And this is something that we abide by, and we've actually expanded upon even further. But these first three core principles are, first and foremost, the principle of respect for persons. And so this is just generally saying that we need to have general respect for our participants and treat them as people, right? And so this includes things like having informed consent, where they are fully aware of all of the risks and potential harm that could come to them from participating in the study. And this needs to be clearly demonstrated and clearly articulated at the beginning of the study before participants agree to take part in a study. It also means that participants can withdraw at any point that they should wish from a study as well. Then we have the principle of benefice or concern for welfare. And again, this is basically just saying that we need to make sure that any potential harm to our participants is outweighed by benefits to our society. So if there is some small level of harm that might be created, we need to have some added benefit or knowledge or something that outweighs that potential harm. So we can't just do a study that is interesting and might harm a participant, but doesn't have some large benefit to it. So this is a key important component here as well. And then the third is this principle of justice. So this is the idea of who really bears the burden or who gets the benefit of the research and who's participating. So I talk about this all the time, but I use an example, say, of using people in prison as participants in a study. And so you say, why might you want to do that? Well, maybe you have a specific question in mind and you want to look at it from the context of someone who really has been out of the view or out of the info of society for a period of time. So we can use sort of a silly example here, but let's say maybe you wanted to study the effects or the pros and cons of an iPhone versus an Android phone. And you wanted to remove the bias of someone who had been using one for years and years. And so what you do is you say, well, maybe I could use prisoners for this. And you say they haven't used a phone in years. They don't even maybe know what an Apple or an iPhone or a cell phone even is. And so you think, well, that's great for my research. I can get this unbiased view and I can use these people with no preconceived notions of these phones. And you say, that's great. And then you learn that maybe one of the phones is better. And you take that information and you go back into society with that information. And maybe that benefits people in society that use one or the other phone, and it makes one of them better and you improve components of that. But here's where this comes back to the principle of justice. Those who took part in the study, that were the prisoners in this case, had no way to benefit from the knowledge gained in that study. So any knowledge that you gained about cell phones would never benefit them while they're in prison because maybe they aren't able to use a cell phone. And so, again, this is a silly or extreme example, but this really kind of highlights this core principle that those participants in your study have to also be able, at least in some way or as a population of people, be able to benefit from the knowledge gained from that study. And so you have to kind of be careful about who you're using, who's bearing the burden of participating in research, being the people that can also benefit from that research as well. So these are the three core principles of the Belmont Report, which again came from a lot of these unethical studies and sort of reviewing them to create this report. Now, we in psychology also rely on APA, and APA has its own set of ethical principles, and you can find them on the APA website. And what these have done is actually built upon or expanded upon the three core principles of the Belmont Report. And so what we call this is sort of the Belmont +2. So we have APA's 5 general principles. And so you can see the 3 core principles from the Belmont Report on the left, and you can see how those are expanded upon in the APA sort of 5 principles. So respect for persons really stays the same. And then we have that benefice or concern for welfare gets broken up into two kind of components. We have sort of the same idea of benefice and non-malfeasance, or basically, maximizing benefit and minimizing harm. But then we also have this other sort of component of this, which is fidelity and responsibility, which is also just basically having this openness, this trusting aspect, and this sort of professional behavior when conducting your research. And then we see the justice component break down into two categories again. We have just that core justice, which is what we talked about, making sure those that are bearing the burden of the research, participating in it, are also able to benefit from that research. And then that breaks down into the second or the last component here of integrity, which again is just striving to be accurate and honest in one's reporting and research as they're practicing. So again, really just kind of a more detailed way of breaking down these components that APA likes to organize and structure from this perspective. We can also talk about how APA kind of identifies some core components that you sort of need to use and have in your research. And so some of these are things that you are going to do as well. And we're going to talk about these throughout this class, and you're going to kind of be a part of and involved in kind of creating and doing for your own research. So for example, ethics training, city training in our case, is something that we need to do in order to be certified to work with human subjects and human participants. And it teaches and goes through a lot of these historical examples of unethical research and how we've improved upon that going forward. We also have institutional review boards, or IRBs, which are ethics boards at different universities and institutions that look at our research and approve it before we actually start doing it. Make sure that what we're doing is ethical and abides by these standards. We need to make sure we do things like have informed consent. We need to have, if we have deception, we need to use debriefing as well and explain at the end what was deceived to participants. Any type of research misconduct that is done, like fabricating data, having different, ethical or plagiarism issues, are things that APA doesn't tolerate and would be barred from publication. And so these are things that we assess and we look at, and we make sure that we're not including or incorporating in any research that is sort of published under these standards. And then finally, we can talk a little bit about animal research here as well. We're going to dive into that a little bit more. But animal research is a whole separate area that has a whole separate board of ethics committees that kind of review any studies that use or look at animals in their research. There's added protections used for that as well. And so when we look at this idea of animal research, there's a few kind of components that we can break this down into. But generally speaking, the first question we ask is, why are we using animals in the research in the first place? So what is the purpose of animal research? So is it because what we're trying to test is unethical to test in humans? And most of the time that tends to be the case, but we need to be careful because there are limits also in what we deem ethical to test in animals as well. And we'll see some examples of how we've learned that as well. So we have still ethical considerations, even in animal research, on how to make sure that we're, again, balancing the welfare of the animals with the knowledge gained from the research. We want to try to prevent as much unnecessary suffering as possible and minimize that harm as much as we can in these research practices. And like I said, there are actually more trained and more strict review boards that review animal research than for human research. And so there's two studies, or there's two kind of components of animal research that I'll use as examples here to kind of highlight this. The first one is Harlow's studies using monkeys, and his studies looked at sort of, and you may have heard of this in other psychology classes, but looked at the idea of basically whether infantile monkeys preferred the warmth of a soft, comforting mother versus a hard, wireframe mother that provided nourishment and food. And so it looked to see what was the type of nurturing that these baby monkeys preferred. Did they choose to go to the mother that provided warmth and comfort and physical comfort, or did they choose to go to the more rigid kind of just wire structure, but that did provide food? And ultimately what they found is that there was a preference. The monkeys did prefer the warm, comforting mother, but the downside and really kind of the sad part of this is that they would actually forego physical nourishment that they needed in order to just stay with the warm, comforting mother, and to get them to places where they would try to prefer one over the other. Harlow and his team did sort of put these monkeys in pretty unethical conditions. So isolation, malnourishment, things like that. And these monkeys suffered long-term consequences because of this. And so this is something that, again, sort of we see these unethical studies and we learn from them and develop new standards kind of moving forward. The songbird research is really interesting too, because when we look at researchers that look at songbirds in the wild or capture songbirds to study, these are kind of protected populations specifically, and we look to make sure that these are, taken care of and that they are, not being overly captured or overly taken in, and that they are released, and making sure that sort of this is done in as much of an ethical way as possible. And this is something that we can see sort of develop, and we've seen these changes over time. One interesting piece of this that I find interesting as well is that one of the components of this is trying to move more towards simulation rather than using actual animals. So the idea is to reduce as much of the real population of animals as possible to move more to simulating animals and providing less, harm and risk to real songbirds and real animals in nature. So overall, to kind of wrap this section up, we can kind of think about ethics in research and how we make ethical decisions in our research. It can kind of be tricky sometimes, depending on what your research area is. Sometimes we need to kind of try to balance and prioritize what we're doing in terms of ethics versus knowledge gained. Now, I think most of the time in what we do, especially in this class and at this level, this isn't going to be a huge concern. But when you see, more advanced or other in-depth research, you can start asking yourself some of these questions and how ethics kind of plays into this. But generally speaking, the number one thing is, to follow those core principles, but also just to think about how do we minimize risk as much as possible, and how do we maximize potential benefits and knowledge gained. And so some of the core components and the main things we can do to achieve this is things like informed consent, using minimal deception and less when necessary, and providing any debrief forms and just debriefing participants about the study at the end. And for us at this level, that's normally enough to account for everything. But we can see sort of these higher level, more critical ethical considerations that we take from large scale research in the field of psychology.